Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natnator. Welcome back to your weekly dose of creepypasta. We've had some long intros lately, but this will not be one of them. Let's get right on over to our lovely patrons over on Patreon for the first video of the July round. Awesome bunch we got here. Shoutouts to the disciples this month. We have Tiffany, Backer Puff, Wendy Escalera, Subscribe SoundCloud, The Greatest Nightmare, Teddy Dog, and Vlad Dracula. Super thank you for the support. Now as always, turn out the lights, get comfortable, and let the story begin. I don't want to go to Mimi Linda's anymore, Brittany's little girl Kristen said, as she was getting her ready to take to her mother's house. Brittany was confused by this. Her daughter never had a problem with going to her grandmother's house before. She always dropped Kristen off at her mother's in the morning and picked her up again after work. There were never any complaints about this before. Why? What's wrong, Chris? She asked. I don't like the little girl, was the response. Brittany's mother had just moved into her new house only weeks ago, and though Brittany had already met most of the neighbors, she didn't recall any of them having a little girl. What little girl? Brittany asked. Kristen was silent for a moment, as if she wasn't sure she should continue. The girl in Mimi's room. She comes when I'm watching TV in Mimi's bed and says mean things to me. And she has a bandaid over her eye because her daddy hit her. The blood makes her look scary. I don't like it. Brittany was deeply disturbed and confused by this answer. She didn't understand how Kristen could have come up with such a story. She knelt in front of her daughter, taking her by the shoulders, and looked into her eyes. Chris, what are you talking about? Is this a real little girl, or are you making her up? Kristen stared at her mother silently for a moment, then shook her head, as if refusing to say any more. Brittany sighed in frustration and stood again. She didn't have time for games. She was already running late. Deciding to drop the subject for the time being, she got Kristen into the car and left for her mother's house. Brittany's mother met them at the door once they arrived. She bent down and gave Kristen a hug. Want to go watch TV, sweetie? She asked. Kristen looked at her grandmother and shook her head, then walked in without saying anything. She headed down the hall to the back room that she used when she spent time at her grandmother's house. But as she passed her grandmother's bedroom, she walked by with caution and peeked in carefully before moving on. This reminded Brittany of their earlier conversation. Hey, Mum. Do you know anything about a little girl? Linda looked at her puzzled. What little girl? Brittany wasn't quite sure how to explain what her daughter had said. Well, Kristen said there was a little girl here, and that she was... She hesitated, then shook her head. Never mind. It's probably nothing. I have to get going or I'll be late. Now that she was talking about it out loud, it sounded kind of silly. She hugged her mother goodbye and went to work. Though, the strange talk with her daughter was still on Brittany's mind. It was soon forgotten as things became busy at the office. The day went on normally, and at the end of it, Brittany picked up her daughter and brought her back home. That night, as Brittany was getting Kristen ready for her bath, she noticed 3 scratches on her daughter's upper arm. "Chris, what happened?" she asked in concern. Her daughter looked at her and said in a quiet voice, "I was playing with Chloe and got scratched." Brittany knew Chloe was a playful puppy, but she didn't think she'd hurt her daughter. It was probably just an accident though. She talked to her mother about clipping the puppy's nails so that it wouldn't happen again. Brittany finished giving Kristen her bath and put her to bed. Before she turned out the light, her daughter asked, "Do I have to go to Mimi's tomorrow?" Brittany looked back at her daughter. "No, Mummy's off tomorrow, so you can stay home." She remembered what her daughter had said that morning and paused in the doorway. "Did you see that mean little girl again?" Kristen quickly shook her head and rolled over with her back to her mother, hugging her teddy tightly. Brittany watched her daughter for a moment, then turned out the light and went to her own bedroom. Since she had the next day off from work, Brittany stayed up late watching television. As she was looking for something to watch, she came across a documentary on the paranormal. She had an interest in such things and decided to watch it. The documentary spoke of entities that died violent or traumatic deaths and became restless spirits, unable to move on. They would often stay in the place of their death and haunt it long after they died. Sometimes there would be residual hauntings, nothing more than an echo of past events and people replaying itself over and over. Some were intelligent, using methods such as sounds and visual activity to make their presence known and even interact with the living. Then came the mention of children and spirits, how young children are more sensitive to the paranormal than adults, and can often see things that adults can't. Some spirits can interact or communicate with children, and even attach themselves to them. Sometimes, the spirit can be friendly, but there are times when the entity is dangerous. They can influence the child in negative ways, telling them to do bad things, or they may even hurt or scare the children. These hauntings usually cause strange or negative behavior, and a child may be reluctant to talk about it out of fear of being hurt. Brittany stopped paying attention at that point. Now her thoughts turned to her daughter. The odd behavior and mention of a little girl in her mother's house that couldn't possibly exist, and even the disturbing description she gave. She began to wonder if the scratches on her daughter's arm were actually from the puppy or something else. Was it all just coincidence? Was Kristen going through a phase, or was something else going on? It all seemed a bit far-fetched, but there wasn't enough to go on. She decided she'd talk to her mother about it the next day and see what she could find out. The next morning, Brittany gave her mother a call, hoping to gain more information from her. "Mum, do you know if the people who lived in the house before you had a daughter?" she asked. Linda paused, as if thinking. "No, pretty sure they just had 2 boys. Why?" Brittany looked into the living room at her daughter. She was watching Dora the Explorer and paying no mind to her mother. Brittany spoke softly anyway, not wanting to hear. "Kristen seems to think there's a little girl in your house, and she doesn't like her. She says she's mean to her, and says bad things, and that the way the girl looks scares her because she's bloody." Now that she said it out loud, Brittany felt kind of foolish. She couldn't imagine how strange it must have sounded to her mother. There was a long moment of silence on the other end of the phone. Mum? Is that why Kristen doesn't like coming over anymore? Her mother suddenly asked. Brittany was caught off guard by the sudden question. Did she say something? She doesn't have to. Lately, she just doesn't seem to want to be here. She doesn't like going in the back or watching TV in my bed anymore like she used to. And she asks, how long before you come to get her a lot? It was never like this before. She was always happy to come over, but now she doesn't seem to like it anymore. The description of Kristen's behavior at her mother's house made Brittany feel uneasy. Did it really have something to do with a ghost? Or was Kristen acting out for attention? Her thoughts were interrupted by her mother's loud yawn. Oh, sorry. I haven't been sleeping well, she said. Why? What's wrong? Brittany asked. Well, I keep hearing weird noises at night and... Linda's voice trailed off. And what? Brittany asked. Well, sometimes when I'm sleeping, I get woken up by something that feels like a tug on my sheets. Once I thought I even heard a giggle. I just roll over and go back to sleep, thinking I was just dreaming. But now that I think about it, there have been some strange things going on. Brittany's uneasiness grew. Like what? Well, there are weird noises from time to time, the tug on my bed sheets, and sometimes something isn't where I thought I put it, like it had been moved. And there are times when it feels unusually cold in my room, colder than it should, considering it's summer and all. And Chloe acts weird too. She growls and barks at the empty air, or acts reckless, like something's making her nervous. I figured she just wasn't used to the new house yet. Brittany remembered hearing that animals were just as sensitive to the paranormal as young children, if not more. I never really paid much attention to all of this before, but now that I'm thinking about it, it all seems kind of strange. She paused as if thinking again. There is one other thing. I thought I heard Kristen talking to someone a couple of weeks ago. I looked in on her and she was playing with her tea set and dolls. I thought maybe she was just playing pretend. But what if she wasn't? Linda's voice had a hint of nervousness to it now. Mum, maybe you should look into that house's background or something, just to see if there's anything weird about it, Brittany suggested. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, or if there really was anything to find, but they had no way of knowing unless they tried. I guess I could. Not sure if I really want to know, though. I might end up moving again. Her mother laughed weakly at her attempted joke. Brittany started wondering if she should leave Kristen elsewhere during the day, just until they figured things out. I think I might leave Kristen at Mormore's house during the day, instead of yours, just for a while, she said. Brittany's grandmother was getting up in age, but she always enjoyed visits from her great-grandchildren. Brittany just hoped it would solve the problem, even if it was only temporary. Well, all right, I guess, Linda said, sounding a bit disappointed. Brittany couldn't help feeling guilty. She knew her mother enjoyed the company she got from Kristen, since she lived alone. Thanks, Mum. Let me know what you find. After hanging up with her mother, Brittany looked in on Kristen again. She was still watching Dora the Explorer and answering Dora's questions. "Chris, how would you like to stay at Mormore's instead of Mimi's for a while?" Kristen turned around to look at her mother. "I won't go to Mimi's house anymore?" "It's just for a little while," Brittany said. Kristen nodded solemnly. "Okay, Mummy." She looked back at the TV, but now seemed less enthusiastic than before, and had grown quiet. The sudden change in her daughter's behavior added on to Brittany's concern. She wasn't sure what to make of the situation between the strange activity in her mother's house and the effect it was having on Kristen. Was there really something going on, or was her daughter just having a childhood fantasy and would grow out of it soon? But what about the strange things occurring in her mother's house? Could it just be coincidence? Brittany felt frustrated, knowing there was nothing she could do until they found out more about the house's history. For now, all she could do was wait. That weekend, Brittany was off. She hadn't heard anything from her mother yet. Kristen spent the days with her great-grandmother, and there had been no more mention of a little girl or strange behavior. It brought Brittany some relief to have her daughter back to normal. She was almost sure the whole incident had been a phase, maybe just a little girl's way of getting her working mother's attention, or her way of saying she didn't like her grandmother's new house. Either way, Brittany was just glad that things were better now. She sat on the couch with her laptop, while Kristen lay on the living room floor, coloring in a Dora the Explorer coloring book. Brittany's cell phone suddenly rang, and she got up to answer it. It was her mother. "Britt, I'm on my way over. There's something I need to show you. But first check your email. I sent you something I found. I think you need to see it." Linda's voice sounded disturbed. Brittany froze at the sound of her mother's tone. "What is it?" she asked. "Just go check," her mother said. "I can't talk now. I'm driving. I'll be there soon." There was a cold feeling in the pit of Brittany's stomach as she hung up the phone. She almost didn't want to look at her email, but she sat on the couch and picked up her laptop again. She opened her account and clicked on the email from her mother. It was a news article dated about 13 years ago. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the title, "Girl Beaten to Death by Father in Home." She scrolled down, reading the details of the article. A 6-year-old girl was being abused by her alcoholic father. After being questioned by a teacher who was concerned about the bruises on the girl, she told her that it was done by her father. When the father found out what she had told the teacher, he began beating her in a fit of rage and ended up killing her. Paramedics pronounced the child dead at the scene. Cause of death was massive head trauma. The father was arrested and found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. At the bottom of the article was a picture of the little girl in a kiddie pool in the front yard of her home. The house in the background was the very house Brittany's mother was living in now. She was an adorable little girl, with light blonde hair pulled up into pigtails and pretty blue eyes. A wide smile with a missing front tooth adorned a somewhat chubby little face. She looked a little younger than 6 in the picture. Perhaps it was a photo from an earlier, happier time. A tear rolled down Brittany's cheek as she stared at the picture. Her heart ached for the young life that had been tragically cut short. How could someone do something so terrible to a child, especially their own? She looked at her own daughter and couldn't imagine ever hurting her like that. At that moment, Brittany recalled the way Kristen described the girl she had seen. How she had a bandaid over her eye because her father hit her, and that she was bloody. Brittany slowly stood and walked over to Kristen, carrying the laptop. She knelt and turned it to face her daughter. Chris, is this the little girl in Mimi's house? Kristen looked at the picture and then looked up at her mother. Her face was blank. Her daddy told her not to tell anyone he was hitting her. She should have listened, and he wouldn't have hurt her like that. I wasn't supposed to tell anyone about her either, because she doesn't like it when people say she's not real. But I was bad and told anyway. That's why she scratched me. She looked back at her coloring book and continued coloring as if it were just a casual conversation. Brittany almost dropped her laptop from the shock. The sudden ring of the doorbell made Brittany jump. She remembered her mother had said she was on her way and put the laptop down, hurrying to the door. Her mother looked somewhat pale when she opened it. I'm freaking out, Britt. This is really messed up, she said as she walked in past Brittany, clutching something in her hand. Brittany followed her mother into the kitchen and found her pacing back and forth, nervously. Mum, what's wrong? Linda stopped pacing and looked at her. Well, I talked to the people who lived in the house before me, and they said they didn't know anything about the previous owners, but they were sure that a little girl lived there. In the front bedroom, they found disturbing drawings on the wall, inside the closet, that looked like they were done by a girl. They put wallpaper up inside to cover them up. Brittany was confused. Wallpaper? Why not just paint the walls? They did, her mother said nervously. The drawings kept coming back. Brittany felt chills run down her spine. Kept coming back? Through the paint? Linda nodded. They thought for sure their sons were doing it, but the boys insisted it wasn't them. They said it was the girl. Brittany's blood ran cold. It was the same thing Kristen had spoken of. She said they figured the boys were just making up stories so they wouldn't get into trouble and just let it go. Anyway, they ended up putting in the wallpaper and covered everything up. I went in the closet the other day and ripped the wallpaper out. I found the drawings. Linda held her hand out and revealed some photos. Brittany slowly took them from her and began looking through them. She felt like she was going to be sick. There were doodles of faces, varying in size along one side of the closet. Most of them appeared to be of a man, a very angry one, with a big mouth as if he were yelling. Others looked like they were of a sad little girl that was crying. There were even a couple of figures, a big one holding up its arm as if it were about to bring it down, and a small one that looked like a little girl bent down as if cowering with the words, "Don't hit me," coming from the smaller figure. There were other words like, "Why?" and "What did I do?" written on the wall. Brittany leaned against the counter for support. She felt weak as she stared in horror at the photos. You said these were in the front bedroom? Yeah, Linda answered. Brittany looked up at her mother. "That's the room you're in, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Her mother was fidgeting nervously as she nodded. "Yeah, and that's not all, unfortunately. I started asking around about the family that lived in the house before the previous owners, and found an older couple who've been living in the neighborhood for over 20 years. They told me about the family and the little girl that lived there. Apparently, the mother got into an accident on her way to work one morning and was killed. Soon after the mother died, things changed for them. The father got depressed and started drinking heavily, and the little girl stopped playing with the other children and coming outside like she used to. She wasn't happy and cheerful anymore. They never suspected he was beating her, though. Not until the day the ambulance showed up, and they brought her little body out on a gurney, covered in a blood-stained sheet." Linda's voice faltered, and she stopped. Tears built up in her eyes as she shook her head. "How could someone do that?" she asked in a trembling voice. How could he just beat his own little girl and kill her?" Brittany shook her head. "I don't know, Mum. I just don't know. How could anyone lay their hands on a child like that?" As a mother, she found the act unthinkable and unforgivable. It made her sick just thinking about it. Brittany looked at the pictures of the drawings again. Everything was starting to make sense now. This poor little girl had been betrayed and killed by the very person who was supposed to love and take care of her. Now she was a restless spirit, full of anger and unable to move on. It was heartbreaking. "I'd like to meet that bastard and give him a taste of his own medicine," she said angrily. "Unfortunately, that's not possible," Linda said bitterly. "He's dead." Brittany looked at her mother in shock. "The article said he got life in prison. Did they change it to the death penalty?" "No. The couple I talked to told me he died not long after killing his daughter. Apparently, he wasn't completely unremorseful for what he did. He couldn't live with the guilt of his crime. He committed suicide in prison a couple months after he was sentenced." It wouldn't bring back the little girl, though, and it wouldn't release her spirit. "But you know, despite all these facts, we still don't have any evidence of a ghost," Brittany said. Linda reached into her purse that was sitting on the counter. "Actually, there is one more thing." She pulled out a digital recorder. "I remembered hearing on Ghost Hunters and other paranormal shows that if you use a recorder, you could catch the voice of an entity. I put one in my room and went grocery shopping. When I came back, I listened to it." She slowly held it out to Brittany. "I caught something." Brittany looked at the recorder in her mother's hand and took it from her. She pressed the play button, and it picked up where her mother had stopped it. For a moment, there was nothing. A bird chirping in the tree out front, a car passing by on the street, and then she heard it. A little more than a whisper, a little voice with only one thing to say. "Don't tell." Brittany and Linda finished putting the last of the boxes into the moving van. Brittany's uncle pulled the door closed, then climbed into the driver's seat. Living alone was becoming financially difficult for Linda. the bills becoming more than she could handle on her own. Since Brittany and Kristen were the only ones living in their house, it had been decided that Brittany's mother would move in and to help out her single mother-daughter. "Is that everything?" Brittany asked. Her mother nodded. "Yeah, I think so. Where's Kristen?" Brittany looked around. Her daughter was nowhere in sight. "Maybe she's inside. I'll go look." The inside of the house was bare now. Everything had finally been cleared out. She saw no sign of Kristen at first. But then she heard a voice coming from the hallway. It was Kristen's. Brittany quietly made her way to the hallway's entrance and peeked into the front room, previously her mother's bedroom. Kristen was standing in the middle of the room, facing the closet. "It's okay. I forgive you," she said in the direction of the open closet doors. Brittany slowly walked in behind her daughter, noticing the air in the room felt cold. Too cold for summer weather, and too cold for a house that no longer had the air conditioner running. "Chris, who are you talking to?" she asked. Kristen turned around to face her mother. "Jenny," she said. Brittany walked up closer to Kristen, looking at the empty space in the closet that she had been talking toward. "Who's Jenny, sweetie?" She already had a feeling before even asking. "The little girl. She was saying sorry for hurting me. Her daddy always said sorry after hurting her too." She looked back at the closet. "No, we're not going away because of you. It's because Mimi's having trouble paying the bills." She paused, as if listening to someone talking. "I don't know. It's a grown-up thing, I think." Brittany got goosebumps and reached down to take Kristen's hand. "Well, it's time to go. Mimi and Uncle Kurt are waiting." As they started to walk out, Kristen looked back and gave a little wave to the open closet. "Bye, Jenny. I hope you can see your mummy again one day." Brittany didn't stop as she walked her daughter out of the house, closing and locking the door behind them. Her mother was already in her car waiting on them. "Everything all right?" she asked through the open window. "Yeah, everything's fine," Brittany responded. She hooked Kristen into her seat, then went around to the driver's side and got in. Starting up her car, she took one last look at the house. For a moment, she thought she saw something in the front bedroom window. A pale face with light-colored hair tinged with a darker color hanging down around it. Brittany quickly blinked her eyes and looked again. It was gone. It was probably just a glare from the sun on the glass. At least, that's what she told herself. She pulled into the street and headed for the corner with her mother's car and the moving van following behind. She watched them drive away in their cars. Her new friend was gone already. They got along at first, but then the other girl said she didn't like the way she looked and didn't want to see her anymore. It made her mad, and that's why she said mean things to her. She wished she could wear nice clothes and brush her hair again, but everything was bloody now. Jenny turned and went back to her closet, the place she used to hide from her daddy when he was mad. Her head was hurting, and she wanted to rest. Maybe next time she wouldn't be mean to her new friend, but maybe next time they won't tell.